Joining me today is Patterson, a Senior Fullstack Developer at a digital agency here in Toronto. Before I begin, I want to thank you for joining me in this podcast, or maybe you're seeing it in YouTube. I really appreciate the chance that you're giving me with this short video. Well, short. I talked to him for 2 hours and I'm releasing it in 2 parts. So it's not actually that short, but it's still a video and it's still a podcast. So thank you. I want to, if this is your first time joining me, I have put up a few points here. This is primarily, I intend to make this a podcast where I discuss the careers of the great programmers that I've worked with, as well as diving into an exploration of their thinking, as well as engaging and perhaps modeling deliberate and continuous self-reflection on our practice, in terms of the business and craft of software development and engineering. One thing that I'm finding in this endeavor as a nascent podcast, there is a lot more time available for me alone, where I can record things and I can work on the podcast where I don't have to coordinate around the schedule of my 2-year-old son or a third party, for example, arranging a time to spend 2 hours talking to Kai. So one of the things that I will be experimenting with is educational content. I'd like to talk about some of the big ideas I see in tech, bring forward larger, wider social issues on our relationship to technology and technology's relationship to the world around us. About myself personally, I am a technical architect at a digital ad agency here in Toronto. I've got 10 years experience there, but I have 20 years professional programming experience in industry. I'm a trained educator. I'm a former high school teacher. And what else? I put some points down there. I would love your feedback. Oh my God, that's the most important thing, is hearing back from you. This interview is going to be released in 2 parts, but Netflix style, so if you truly want to binge 2 hours of programming talk in one sitting, then you are welcome to. In the first half, Kai and I talk as colleagues and friends. I've trimmed out as much as I can in terms of the terms that you are unlikely to recognize. There are, however, I feel, some interesting points that he raises through that discussion, and I did not want to cut that or leave that on the cutting room floor. About partway through, you should actually see the look on his face at this one special moment where he suddenly realizes that he's actually doing an interview. His demeanor changes, and we manage to move into a more formal discussion where in the second part we move into a longer and broader discussion of the whole course that his career took, and how he ended up where he is, and his thoughts about the things that he learned along the way. And I think that you will hopefully find that interesting. You may identify with it, or you may pick up something you would think about for your own growth and development in this career. Okay. Before I cut to the interview, which was recorded earlier, I want to say that you, as the community, are the fuel that I really need to keep going on this. I think some part of this, I do get something out of this on my own. I would be doing these interviews anyways because I am trying to improve as a developer. I'm trying to level up my skill set, and what better way than to talk to people who I see as experts in the field. But with that said, your comments, your likes, your subscribes, your shares, your stars on the GitHub repo are all very important to me. Your feedback is very important to me. I cannot improve unless you tell me what I've done, what I could do better, and what you do like. Those are both very useful. The feedback has been incredible in terms of helping me improve in the process so far. I think that if you look at the previous video and compare it to this one, you can see that the framing of the screen is far better. The position of the camera, my distance to the camera is probably better, I think. My father phoned me 3 times to belabor the point that I should increase the number of interesting things to look at in the background around me. So I went and I did that. So those things that you say, the things that you think I could do better with, and the things that you really like are all very valuable data points in me growing and becoming more professional in this stream. And with that, I will fade to the interview. Thank you. Or maybe I'll cut. I don't know. Let's get recording so we don't miss anything. How you doing, fella?
Hey, good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. So how has day 1 of vacation been, by the way?
Good, good. An awful lot of nothing whatsoever. Nothing. Just nothing.
You spent an awful lot of time talking to people at work for a guy who was on vacation, I'll tell you that much. So
I usually seem to, my first couple hours of the first day of vacation, I seem to usually do that.
It's really hard to disconnect from just the puzzles you're trying to solve and making sure that the people around you are like, they're okay without you. Do you find that?
I do. And in particular, I was so brain dead last week that basically, like, my job on Friday, I really didn't finish on Friday.
Right.
So it more or less dragged into, through the weekend. And then it's like, well, okay, I pretty much have to make contact on Monday, to give us a status report on that, especially given that the status report is I'm not doing it the way you said.
Right. Oh, right. Because the choice of React versus not doing that.
Versus not React. Yeah. And that's another one. It was, to me, it's another sign of how brain dead I was last week, that I could not articulate to myself why I didn't want to do it. And I didn't want to do it. I knew I didn't want to do it.
Right.
And it just seemed like an overcomplicated idea. But even beyond that, there was something lurking that I'm like, no, this is
right.
And then I did it. I looked at the page and I'm like, oh, right, that's why. There's no HTML in the page, and I have a feeling that's going to irritate some people.
I mean, so it's the question of, do we use? So we are designing what is effectively a static site. There might be a real-time dynamic stock ticker on it, or just one little thing on the site, and somebody on the team, or actually quite a few people on the team, want to use React because they're a little bored of doing static websites, right?
Yeah, and I guess my feeling on that one is, why don't we learn how to build static websites correctly, and then we can get bored of it.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, and
right? I mean, that's just, it's like React doesn't solve any problem that we actually have in general,
except for boredom.
Well, and I'm not okay. I mean, I suppose it's possible that it would be a solution to that, but I don't even consider that to be an ironclad guarantee, right? It's like, well, that's a possible solution to the boredom, but and it's anyway. I mean, it was really, once I was sort of really digging into it. And by the way, there is in case we ever do have an actual need to build a React website with the back end, .NET does have good support for baking it right in.
Yeah.
So they don't, what I was noodling over was they wanted React, but they didn't want a single page application. It was like each page would be its own thing. And
would be its own React page.
As my like brain is fuzzily trying to think through this because I've been so fucking dead mentally, I was sort of like, okay, so basically that means each page is its own app using shared components, but basically each page is going to be built separately. And I'm like, okay, so I can't really use any of the .NET built-in SPA stuff as is. Right. I literally made projects. This is how far down the rabbit hole I went before my brain kicked in and told me that was like to just slap me and said, stop it. I went and I made sample projects. I used MVC, I used web app, I used the empty web, and I used React. And I like compared what it does for each one. Yeah. Which, good news, I get what startup.cs is about now. I'm like, okay.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, I can read my way around that now and get a sense of, I could read one of those now and get a sense of, okay, here's what the project has got. Cool. Like, right. I'm definitely starting to figure out what I'm doing in .NET. I think a lot of what confused me for the first long while was that each of our projects has a different folder structure. And I'm just used to languages where the place where you put something and the name you give the file matters. Right. And so it's taking me a while with .NET to go, basically, they don't really care. They just concatenate all the files together into classes and go, right? So, yeah. But no, so that was kind of cool. I saw the different startup options and kind of how that works, compared it to our unbranded one. And I was like, okay, I see what the React one is doing. And I'm like, they've also baked in a lot of really cool shit. Like it's God. It'll go and build all of the React stuff for you as a part of the build process, and it even has a caching server built in that'll handle the static files the web app produces and shit like that. It's really quite nicely baked together. But I was going to have to fuck with it. I was either going to have to take the MVC one or one of them and kind of graft React onto the top, or take the React one and kind of remove the SPA part of things and change it to be a sort of some kind of multi-build type of a thing, right? Yeah. Anyways, thankfully,
where is the business value in that? Because
there was no business. My brain is telling me all the way through this that there's no business value in it. I mean, I've seen their old website, and I'm given to understand that the new one isn't radically different from the old one. It's like it's a rebuild, it's a different look, feel, but it's not a radically different feature set or whatever. And I'm like, okay, so their old one was a site. That's all, right? Like nothing. Yeah. So,
I mean, it may as well have been a WordPress site.
The old one was a WordPress
site. Oh, wow. Actually, yes. And they want to do something that looks a lot like a WordPress site.
Right. Yeah. I reviewed that WordPress site, so I can tell you what it does, which is pretty bog standard shit. Like, so no, there was never any need for the components end of things, but I'm like, okay, I don't know. Like I said, I was more than anything, I was kind of just too far gone to pick a fight over this. All right, just fucking do it. But then as I'm going through it, I'm realizing how kind of like finicky it's going to be. And then anyways, finally somewhere in there, I'm like, okay, well, let's just see what it would look like it's an SPA. And first of all, let's make sure this React thing actually builds and runs. Fiddle with it a bit. Then it did. I'm like, okay, all right, so that's pretty cool. It runs. I could run with this. All right, let's just view source. And literally that's what I had to do before I woke up and was like, fuck me, of course. It's an empty goddamn HTML page. Yeah. That's not gonna fucking, you know what it was I was starting to think through? This is how stupid I was. I'm like, it's only a single, if we had one page like this, how would we manage the different meta tags and things for the different pages? We'd have to be injecting them. And then that was finally when my brain woke up and said, what do you mean injecting them? That's not going to matter a damn for the search engines. Wait a minute. Right. The search engines aren't going to see any page content. Oh, that's why my subconscious didn't want to do.
Yeah. I mean, actually,
okay, subconscious. Now I know.
Yeah. So the search engines actually, I think, do have I mean, the search engines now execute the JavaScript, and so they can detect the content of single page apps. But I mean, it really does sound needlessly complex for, you know.
I've never heard of a search engine literally building a DOM from scratch.
Oh, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, maybe, unless I haven't paid attention the last couple of years, but I mean,
yeah,
because that's what they'd have to do. Literally, the entire page is one div,
right?
That React goes and injects itself into and at runtime, right? Like there is nothing there.
Yeah.
So anyway, and that was sort of, and then I'm like, okay, well, that combined with the fact that this isn't a needful thing anyways, I'm like, okay, fuck that. I'm just going back and saying, like, no, here's a standard MVC app. I checked the bookings. This was like Sunday night or whatever. I checked the bookings and I'm like, okay, I see that there's front end devs working on this all next week, so they need something to do.
They need it.
And I'm like, well, okay, that also, like, if we were doing it in React, who the hell would be monitoring to see what the hell they do? Right? Like at this point, we can hand them an empty, .NET MVC site, and they know what they're doing. Okay, page, go make the page, right? Or if they don't know how, they ask you, and that's fine, right? But if they're like, if it's all React, I'm like, I don't know whether, I mean, they know React, yes, but that doesn't mean that if you hand them a blank page and say, go fill it with React, that the results are going to be, awesome. Anyway.
Right.
So I didn't get any resistance when I said,
I
didn't React and we can't, and here's why. I mean, it went fine.
Yeah.
Which was also kind of like, for embarking on what is for us, a new paradigm for a project that we as a team have never done before. I'm like, that's kind of alarming.
At a time when, the team is running pretty hot, right? So if you are working with a team that's running hot, and then you have these multiple simultaneous threads of projects all running in parallel, and then you throw in this one that has this next level ramp up of complexity, are you not risking further stress to the team? And
there seems to be, I think we need to be cautious, and by we, I basically mean you and I, as I think maybe the gatekeepers of sanity a little bit over the next while. I think we need to be cautious. We need to support this newfound energy to be changing and improving how we do things, because that's awesome. But I think you and I may need to be the sober voices in the room going, like,
slow down.
Are we talking about making this change or trying this new thing in order to solve a business need that we definitively have, or are we just changing this for the sake of changing something? And if it's the latter, let's carefully examine the pros and cons and see if this is in fact a costless change, because odds are it's not. So, but seriously, right? And if we're going to experiment in things like that, this is a good project to do it with. It's a relatively small website. It's a corporate website, not a branded website, right? So it's not probably going to have quite the magnifying glass put to it that that our first one did. And so, it's like, okay, this is a good project to play around on a little bit. But I mean, that doesn't mean going crazy with shit that we don't need. And component framework, we've got a lot of problems, but component framework isn't one of them. We want to organize our shit better and be more modern and blah, 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 blah. And that translates to React, right? But it's like, React does a specific thing. It groups your HTML in components and puts the code that runs those components next to the HTML itself.
Right.
It is a component manager. It's not a style manager. It doesn't do shit about your CSS. It doesn't do shit about your state management. It doesn't ultimately do anything to necessarily increase reusability. I
Right.
mean, it offers the possibility of it, but in just the same way that having object-oriented programming in your language doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to write a bunch of reusable, well-built classes, right? Like,
Right.
right? We've all seen what
Yeah.
happens when somebody who doesn't know what they're doing goes and makes some 50-class library that turns out to be completely impossible to extend in any meaningful way. Like,
I mean, some of us have written those, I think.
well, but hopefully most of us got it out of the way back in high school,
right?
Whatever,
Yeah.
Right? Like back in the day when nobody was being saddled with it for the next 10 years, you know.
Right, and so that's one of the concerns that we have about picking these new technologies for the team, for the project, for the team, because these projects that we run are long-lived. And if we arbitrarily pick something like React because it's whiz bang, and all of the people who get all of this wonderful learning about React move on to other teams or other projects or other companies, then the new junior devs who come in and get suddenly assigned to work on this legacy project are up the creek. And then you see that this thing atrophies and it becomes more and more expensive. Whereas if you fit within the project framework that your team does time and again, then the new people go, they are more transferable between projects. Yeah. And that's where that comes together.
Well, basically, for the like set up the site ask, I'm like, okay, what are we doing for back end? Are we going to have a back end? Because I don't know, maybe we're going to actually, the decision is we're going to try this one just pure static HTML because we
host it out of an S3 bucket and
host exactly, right?
Yeah.
Plug it in the contact form into whatever. Like, yeah, okay. I mean, it's yeah. I've reviewed the existing corporate site and there's nothing there that couldn't be done with just HTML potentially. But I got back something about, well, we think there's going to be a contact form and we're not sure. And well, okay. So quickly was like, yes, we should have a back end, at least so we've got the option, right? Mm-hmm. Well, how about we go with Node? And I'm like, I mean, my immediate answer basically was, look, I love Node. I do. I'm a Node guy. I'm a JS guy, but I really can't recommend anything but .NET here. Like, yeah. we're a .NET shop. Like, our team is a .NET shop. Our CST is a .NET shop. And by and large, our company is a .NET shop. Why would we use something else?
Yeah.
Why? Like there's no, just why would we, right? And so, okay. So, I mean, again, that wasn't a fight or whatever. I just said, let's do .NET. And it was like, okay. But it's another one of those moments that if somebody who didn't think to ask that question got assigned that task,
they would just do it.
They would just be like, do we have a back end? We should probably have a back end. What should I write it in? Node. Okay. Or somebody going and figuring out how to build a Node website and doing it that way and how it gets half built that way. And now we've got an express.js or whatever the hell. And then
so we've got one,
and then somebody tells the host, and then somebody tells host the cloud team about it.
Yeah.
I don't even know whether I have no idea whether they've ever hosted Node before or whether they want
I'm sure they could. I'm sure they could. If they would just, I mean, they just fire up an elastic beanstalk and say, put whatever you want on it. So
sure. But
and they say, now it's your problem once you have the.
Well, and that's the problem. If Node isn't something that they're used to running at production load, if that's not something that we do on a regular basis, then not that they're going to say no. Yeah, sure. All they're ultimately doing is providing a server and a VM somewhere by a fancier name. But what if we run into a problem? What if it starts falling over? Right? What if? And then we're live in production. We're live in production, and we don't know what's going on. None of our developers know anything about Node either, right? Nothing. Like, I think I'm the only person on our team that really has experience in Node.js, and even I have not run high volume production loads in myself either, technically, right? I know how to do it. I know the theory. I know whatever. I would do it with confidence. But anyways, whatever. It's all like, why would we use anything but .NET, for fuck's sakes? Like,
yeah,
it's just, that's a no-brainer, right? That should not be something that's even a decision point, right, on our team.
Right.
But I had there was an interesting, not a conversation, really just one line of a conversation I heard. We were talking about picking frameworks and picking technologies. This was the talk I had before that Friday group discussion, right? Where I was bringing it up first. And basically the thing that stuck in my head was that he was surprised that I was advocating for React. Right. Rather than he's like, I'm kind of surprised that you weren't going for something shiny or newer or, you know, web components or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I don't like, I actively do not like React. I don't. I really don't. I don't like it at all. But that's beside the point. It's perfectly functional for the job that we would need it to do. Right. And it is the obvious choice for our team, for our CST, and for this company, because our team, to the degree that they know any component type JavaScript framework, it's going to be React, right? Because a bunch of them learned it in boot camp or whatever.
And that's because React is what's going on in the boot camps now.
In the boot camp, right? Yeah.
Right.
So all of the boot campers have at least been exposed to it. All of the more senior devs are going to know what it is. They're going to, if they haven't used it, they'll pick it up quickly enough, right? Other teams, from what I've seen elsewhere, it's like React is also the go-to elsewhere. The company, by and large, uses React.
Right.
So that means not only does our own team have more experience in React than anything else, anyways, but if we're borrowing people, or we can expect that, again, if anybody has any experience in a JavaScript component framework, it's likely to be React. So why pick something else? And then on top of that, if that wasn't enough, which it would be already on its own, we already have a fucking React app that we're supporting.
Right. So
right?
that's the time.
It's not even a like brown sweat clear. It's not even a blank page thing where it's like, well, we don't have any yet, so we can pick whatever we want. It's like, yes, we do. It's a React app. Right.
So
but
that's the time to double down on the framework that you're using, because that means when you have two of them, all of a sudden the skill you develop on the one starts being translatable to the other. And
so suddenly it's not like, oh, Kai's got to go and train now, so that he's not the only one who can fix it when it goes south. Now it becomes, okay, now we're training people on this project type that we have that's just like an email or an ISA or AEM or whatever, it's a type of thing now. So yeah, to me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, it's a no-brainer to use React. I mean, the only, given that starting point, we already are using it. We already have people that know how to use it, and the rest of the company uses it by default. Like, it just doesn't make sense to use something else. Like, the only reason why I would recommend something else is if I was absolutely convinced that React was completely and utterly broken, right? Or like about to become so or something.
Yeah. Or the other thing
except Facebook, right? So like, that's not going to happen in a year soon. Like, it's not going anywhere, man. It's perfectly fine. I don't like it, but it's absolutely adequate to the job that we need it to do, right?
So, I mean, that is to say that as a that is to say that as a developer making choices, you're not making choices for yourself. You're doing this stuff almost in an egoless fashion in order to benefit the team as a whole and the project as a whole. And
I agree with that. Absolutely. I'd actually I would say the mindset that I would ascribe to myself to try to have, and that I would want others to have, I would say isn't egoless. It's actually very egocentric. but
Okay.
with a very specific criterion for it, right?
Okay.
It's like I want to feel like I have very personal skin in the game of the choices that I make for tech.
Right.
But the reasons for having that skin in the game are not to satisfy my curiosity or my wanderlust or my want to try out some newfangled thing I've heard about. It should be what is going to make my life better and easier, and by proxy, everyone else's lives better and easier, right? Not just me, but the many other me-like people who will touch this over time, right? That I'm making this decision on behalf of like future me and the other future me, and the other future me's who technically aren't me but could be, right?
Right. And when then do you, because we all see these whiz bang new things that come along. When do you look at those? When do you look at the ones that you want to try?
For me, I would say there's two possible cases. One case is when you have a need that is legitimately new, right? Something that does not fit your existing mold. And more generally, when it's at least a 50-50 shot. At least that's the starting gate, is that it's like, well, we could use the things that we're used to using or do it the way we're used to doing it, but it's not a great fit. Right. And because I know we have experience with the way we do things, so I can quite confidently say, yeah, we can probably make it fit, but it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be ideal. We're going to have to do a lot of fudging. It's going to be hard to maintain. It's going to be hard to extend, whatever the limitations are. So we have this potential for something to come in that would do a better job. And then it's sort of, what's the worst case scenario of switching versus staying? Right. And if it's at least a kind of 50-50, where it's like, well, the new one might turn out to not, we might end up regretting it, but I can at least gauge the odds to myself at a gut check level, because I could never quantify this. At a gut check level, if I can at least bring it to, it's a coin toss, whether our existing stuff is going to work worse than the new thing, right? That it's like, okay, well, at that point, it's not so much that we have nothing to lose exactly, but that the risks involved in trying something new aren't appreciably lower than the risks of doing what we know how to do, right? There's risk both ways, but at least it's kind of even-ish, right? So it's at that point, like, okay, then give it a whirl.
So then you have the upside in the case that you described. The upside being maybe you learn something new, maybe you enjoy it, maybe
maybe it works great, or maybe it falls over really horribly badly. But at least if it does, you can console yourself that A, you've learned something out of the experience, and B, it wouldn't have gone that great if you had made a different choice anyway.
You already knew it was probably going to be hard the other way.
If the thing goes up in flames, when people start yelling, you can say, yeah, but it was going to do that if I didn't make this choice. So it was worth a shot, right? And I'm listening to myself say all of that, and I'm realizing that I'm coming across as being a lot more stodgy than I think of myself as being. I don't think of myself as being particularly shy about doing new things or trying new stuff. But how can I say, to me, there's a real distinction between trying some new technique and actually investing in a new piece of third-party technology, right? I will happily reformat, reimagine, rebuild, any word you want to put to it, code that we already own.
Like the time you refactored the JavaScript that I refactored, and we went back and forth like 3 times to settle on what was that, the YouTube video thing?
Oh, did we go back and forth on that multiple times? Oh, I'd forgotten about that.
Because I refactored yours, And then you came along and you said, I don't understand any of this. I'm going to put it back the way that I like to read it.
Oh,
and
yeah.
we left it your way. I learned my lesson.
I do remember that. I normally would not do that, but I think it was I think that was probably
desperation.
I think that was probably an 11 p.m. Friday or Saturday afternoon or some shit type of a thing like that, where I'm just like, I truly don't know what's going on here, and I got to fix this right now, so I don't have time to figure it out or find out or anything. I mean, normally I don't like resetting people's code just for shits and giggles, so to speak.
Right.
But that's not to say that I won't do it plenty with code that I just find lying around, right? Like to me, there's also a very big difference in my head. Am I looking at code that you just PR'd yesterday?
Yeah.
Or am I looking at code that, for all I know, was written by some dude 5 years ago who's long gone?
Yes.
Who, got fired for malpractice, for all I know, right? And in the case of some of the code I've seen us using, like most of the bad code I've seen on our team can be put down to poorly maintained, right? Used longer than its shelf life.
Yes.
But there's certainly a share of code I've seen that I'm like, I cannot imagine what need this would have filled nicely at any point in time, right? Like this couldn't possibly have been great when the day it was made. It was at best functional, kind of, sort of, barely the day it was made. And that actually characterizes a lot of our code. Is like, I think a lot of the reason why our code is such a mess, and speaking of ISAs, basically, the reason why most of it is such a mess is because originally it was made with very little imagination. Right. And you can so see the difference between code that has been deliberately made with extensibility and the future in mind. Versus code that isn't. Right. And actually that YouTube thing is a perfect example of that, to my mind. No, the front end, I don't remember. I don't remember what was going on there. But the back end, I do. And I remember that both of us had pretty much the same thought, which is that MVC framework has that separate areas things can go into, right? And we already were using that. And I'm like, well, let's have an API area and an API controller, right? Even though we only have one API call, but it's like, let's make an area clearly labeled API calls go here now. And if it only ever has the one, then that's fine. But I would far rather see that than shove some JSON returning call into a controller whose job otherwise is HTML. You know what I mean? It just on every level, my brain says, no, this should be in its own clearly marked area, labeled API. I'm sure both of us have seen projects where some dev ends up going like, oh, it's just one Ajax call. I can just shove it in anywhere. And then, fast forward 3 years later and 20 other people
never find it.
It's the same thing. You can never find it again. And you've got 50 of them now because every following dev figures that's the pattern for this project. And and so it's little tiny decisions like that add up, right? It's like that could well be the difference between that project being maintainable or not maintainable 3 years down the road. Probably not like alone, just that one choice, but the cumulative effect of those choices is the difference between this is readable and understandable 3 years from now, or this is junk that nobody has the slightest clue how to maintain it, and it just has to be scrapped and rebuilt, right? And I've seen that so often, and our ISA code is like that, basically, that it's so much of it. I'm like, it's so, what's the word I'm looking for? It's so intertwined in an unpatterned way now that there's no way out. Like it cannot, a lot of it be slowly refactored into health. It just can't be.
Well, they're so ISAs are effectively, they're effectively web pages that we run on an iPad, right?
Yeah. And they're collections of microsites.
Right. Okay. That's a good description of what an ISA is. And so they each page in an ISA, so or is a standalone, fully functional website with its own CSS, its own JavaScript, yep, fully self-contained. And so is it necessarily the case that these things are just, you know, chonk this one page in here and go? Or is there something that unifies them where you could, how could you refactor this sort of thing in a way that would make it manageable?
So there are ways. And I can kind of describe them. I realize I should clarify what I was saying a few minutes ago when I declared it impossible is not technically impossible. It's more, what's the word I'm looking for? Impractical.
Right.
Meaning I know based on how we handle these projects that the odds of that actually occurring in the way that it would have to occur are either low, or we're measuring the time scale in many years, like right, many years. So we have cases where we have shared libraries, meaning pieces of code or even similar patterns of code that we've built that we apply across all of the different microsites in the ISA project, right? And in some cases, we apply similar patterns across many different ISA projects. And the HTML and everything that we design has sort of, the code started originally to support the HTML, and now the HTML is formatted to support the code that we use, right? And in some cases, the system is relatively simple and therefore changeable, extendable, right? Reasonably speaking. And in some cases, it is very fiddly in a way that basically means that in order to fix it, you would need to slowly refactor and massage that library into shape, and additionally change every use, every case where that library is used or that particular feature is needed,
right,
which means dozens of times, dozens of places, if not hundreds of places in one project. And then you have to go and do the exact same process just as laboriously in the next project, and the third one, and the fourth one, and the fifth one, and the sixth one, etc.
Right.
Which basically would turn that into a multi-year slog.
Right.
And one that we do not have the machinery process-wise to support, basically. So more realistically, how I can imagine us moving forward basically is as a sort of almost a blank slate, where one magical mystical day, if we actually have a sufficient amount of time scheduled for a fairly hefty update to one of these projects, with enough notice, advance notice, we go in and basically we sort of, we do a clean room approach. What is the actual end result need to look like? What are the features we need to support in that? What are the libraries that would support those features in a kind of cohesive, sane, extensible way? All right, let's build those, build the slides, the pages based on them, test it all out. Okay, it's good to go. Now we can replicate that across the entire project. And now we can turn to every other project. We can turn to the team and say, this is how we do it now for new development. We're not going to, right, for new development, which means that basically anytime we're either building a new slide or page, or we're doing a really significant overhaul on an existing page, we just reformat the whole thing, throw out all the JavaScript it was using before, pretty much, and stuff the new ones in.
And what's the return?
Problem.
What's the return on that? What's the return on that? Like,
eventually, many years from now, easier maintenance.
Okay. Right.
I mean, there's short term, there's improvements as well. We end up wasting a lot of time on certain repetitive tasks in development on these slides, or running into the same patterns of QA tickets and feedback problems on these. And some of those really could just be solved at a code level.
Right.
Like, not all of them are process errors. Some of them are just, well, our code sucks and is difficult to work with and makes this job hard, when a better piece of code would be easier to work with, more flexible, and faster to implement and less error prone. So in some cases, there would be a more immediate payoff. In other cases, there wouldn't be. It really is sort of, I feel, well, my experience has taught me, I should say, that you would come back 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months later, and you would find that the project has splintered and become difficult to maintain at a much slower rate.
Okay. Right? You still see that the project would suffer entropy, but
every project does. Yeah. I mean, I've never seen any system so bulletproof or so flawlessly and clearly written that doesn't happen over time.
Right.
But there's definitely differences in the rate at which it happens.
Right.
Right. There are systems where you can come back and you can look at how the code has changed over the course of years, and it really does follow a sensible pattern. It's trending towards entropy, towards chaos, but at a steady rate, not an exponential or logarithmic type rate, right?
Right.
And then there's other patterns that are so chaotic that you write them yourself, and you come back a month later and go, I can't read it. Right. We've all done that. We've all done that to ourselves, right? And I'm like, well, that's the other end of the scale. That's code so unmaintainable that even the author can't maintain it a month later, right?
Right.
And that's, I don't know, my experience over the decades has shown me that that's something that very little focus is ever put on in at any level, but it's the cost difference it makes over as years add up, right?
Do you have any rules to prevent that from happening? Or what do you do to prevent those crazy boondoggle type spaghetti code balls?
Well, one, pick a pattern.
Okay.
Like, I mean, more than anything, that to me is what design patterns are for, right? Is giving things structure over time. So when a new dev comes in, they go, okay, I can kind of naturally see where I should be going and adding my code here, or at least if I'm willing to take some amount of research time figuring this project out, I have the option of finding an ideal place to put it. Maybe you have somebody who comes in and doesn't bother doing that. There's nothing you can necessarily do to stop that, but you can certainly try to make the barrier for entry on a new project as low as possible. Right. And one of the obvious ways of doing that, I mean, you've got, obviously, if you're using libraries and frameworks and things like that, trying to use standard ones that are well documented. But really the first and foremost thing is just, how is the entirety of the code base structured? Yeah. Is it structured in a way that makes sense? Is it structured in a way that anybody who's trained can look at and go, oh, I know what pattern that is. I know how to follow that.
Right.
Right. My particular bent on that, as I guess a child of the 90s, is object-oriented.
Right.
I like classes and objects. I do. I am unabashed, unashamed. I am a class and object guy. I got nothing against functional programming. I mean,
Right.
I'm a JavaScript dev. Believe me, I got nothing against functional programming. I love functional programming, but it's very easy for certain patterns, like the functional style, to become unmaintainable, unreadable mess.
Right.
I'm not saying it has to go that way, but you have to put in some very solid, strong homegrown rules, so to speak, or what you will get inevitably quickly even is a mess. So I am a big fan of classes and objects because they give you a very strong paradigm for that, right? They have a lot of built-in isolation. They have, unless you are horrendously misusing the pattern, you have implied contracts and code separation all the way up and down, right? Yes, you can screw it up, just like you can screw anything up, but assuming that you are starting from a relatively sane hierarchy, future devs have a natural pattern that they can hack on, so to speak, right? Yeah, so that's one. I mean, it sounds so basic, but classes and objects, or failing that, something, but whatever it is, something.
Yeah.
Right.
So tell me, all of this was before my first question from the interview. So I feel like I mean, from a meta perspective on what's going on, I feel like some of those bits where we mentioned specific names and things that might be less charitable towards
yeah, it was about 2/3 of the way through that I realized you had the recording light on, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is supposed to be an interview. I probably shouldn't be like blurting. Some of
that will probably get cut. But from a meta perspective, actually, some of that was actually really interesting, I think. And so, like, what I'm going to try and do is when I watch it back, I'm going to probably try and watch it for the things where we talked about the theories on, like, what is, why would you choose functional, or, why do you choose object oriented? Anyways.
Yep.
So
I love that question, the way, not just the topic, but the specific way you brought it up. What did you say? What do you do? What rules do you have?
Well, what rules do you follow
to avoid having that spaghetti code 2 years down the road? And I've never quite asked myself the question in that way before.
Right.
And that's a really interesting, it puts an interesting spin on it. Because one of the things I've always kind of prided myself on is very good at thinking ahead to what is this going to look like in 18 months, right? And to me, that is what good developers should be doing all the time, is as they're writing code, think not just what does it need to do right now, but what will this be used for in 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months.
Right.
And if you're thinking about that at all times, you will write better code.
Right.
You'll still be wrong the vast majority of the time, but you'll write, like, you're not going to correctly guess much of the time what it's going to be like 18 months from now. Right. I figure I have about a 20 to 25% success rate in that. And I would say that is really damn good.
Yeah. Right.
But it's more the thought exercise of the thing, right? That it's like you're building for the future. But I've never quite thought about the question in terms of, like, well, okay, that's all well and good for me to say that, but specifically, what are some specific things that I do to make that happen? And I'm like, oh, that's a damn good question.
Can I tell you a couple that I've found recently? So within Visual Studio, they have this thing called code analysis. And so if you run the code analysis in Visual Studio, it goes through and it reads and calculates mathematical formulas based on something called, I think it's pronounced like cyclometric complexity. And what that, I mean, it's this calculation about how deep does the code go in? How many functions do you call on the,
right?
like,
How many branching layers does it have and things
how
like
many
that?
layers, and how challenging is it? And in the theory, in the mathematical theory of this, it's harder, it's in theory harder to maintain the things where that number gets higher. And
Right.
so what you do is you look for these places, and if you go into one of these places where you find your high number, you look at it and you go, oh yeah, this function is, maybe it's 200 lines more than it should be. And,
Yeah.
So let's see if I can pop some of those things out of into like smaller functions, and I call them. And
basically, I would say that thing that we do all the time, which is look at a piece of code and see nested if statements, for example, or
right.
nested loops or whatever, nested branching statements of some kind, and going like, yeah, we could probably refactor those into a collection of functions instead.
Yeah, right? So you move the function,
sort of like,
you move the code right over time to,
left. In my head, it's always like the tab count, basically.
Right.
Like, how many indents over are we at the maximum extent of this code? And if it's more than a couple, it's probably worth refactoring,
right,
to simplify. But I that's kind of cool. And I remember reading a little bit a couple years back about that, like, complexity of understanding, but I didn't realize that it was at the point that, like, Microsoft just has a tool you can run that will calculate it.
Yeah, you do analyze menu or something. I'm sure that there are other ones that run on the command line and stuff, but